Well, hello there, Choralosophy audience. I'm Chris Muntz, host of the Choralosophy podcast, and if you are listening to this portion of this short little episode, you are on the main podcast feed. And today, I am just going to drop a little bit of this rumination, a little bit of this reflection in the main podcast feed, and then I'm going to finish it over on the private podcast feed, which can be accessed at patreon.com. Patreon.com/Choralosophy is the optional. Of course, everything on the main feed is always going to be free, but there is an optional feed with extra content, lessons that I've created, behind the scenes discussions on the show at Patreon. You can subscribe for as little as $3 a month. It just debits out of your account every month without even having to think about it, as a way to support the costs, the underlying costs of the show. And so what I'm going to do today is start out a little bit of a reflection I've been thinking about quite a bit. In fact, it has a lot to do with some of the topics that I've been tackling recently on the show. Many of you just heard or saw that the episode most recently was with Dr. Ferdinand of Oakwood University, the Aeolians. And we talked a little bit about some philosophies and some concepts behind a lot of the conversations that we have around social justice in the choral world. And interestingly, this is going to be a fun way to, I think, a kind of a funny way to discuss this. But recently, I'm going to speak cryptically now. There was a well-known composer that kind of went and got himself canceled. And in the response to that, we saw a lot of outcry on social media. We also saw a lot of response from this composer. And I went on the Choralosopher's Facebook page, and I kind of floated the idea to the listeners there, or to the folks there, about what if I were to do an episode on the essay written in response to this cancellation. And I got some good feedback there of, like, they would be interested to hear my thoughts on this, but at the same time, not wanting to draw too much attention to what is not super a positive, I guess you could say, situation. And so I was sympathetic to both of those feedbacks. And so I think what I'll do is I will kind of give some teasers here, and then in the private podcast feed, I will go through the essay in question and discuss that. And what, because one of the things, of course, that is tricky and interesting about running a podcast is there is always going to be, every time I jump on and publish content that includes my opinion, there will be the "who does he think he is" kind of responses from some people. And I knew that going into starting a podcast. Anytime you put your opinions, especially related to a profession, and out there for your colleagues, you're going to get some of that. Hey, this guy's opinion is wrong and he's an idiot, and why is he talking about this online? Well, the great thing about that is that this show comes with a subscribe button, or not, right? And so what I do think, though, is interesting about this situation that I'm cryptically discussing, is that there is some important stuff there for us to talk about. There are a lot of misunderstandings. One of my favorite things to study actually is this concept of how we interact with each other around issues of social justice, race, gender, all those types of things. I read a lot about it. And so in this the essay that I will be discussing, I've got some an attempt, I think, at a charitable reading of the essay, where I try to point out what I think are some valid points, but also point out some really big misunderstandings that are going on with a lot of people related to some of these topics. So if you head over to patreon.com/Choralosophy, you will be able to hear the rest of this episode. For everyone else on the main feed, continue to enjoy all of the free content here and all the great conversations. If you haven't had a chance recently to tune in, we've had some really awesome episodes of late with Dr. Ferdinand, as I mentioned. Dr. Betsy Cook Weber are the most two recent episodes that were just got some great feedback from those conversations, because of course there are two luminaries in the field, and we've got some luminaries coming up as well, which I can't tell you about, because that's another thing we do over on Patreon, is I reveal the guests before they come on, which is really cool. And the people over there know who's coming on ahead of time. And if they want to, they can drop questions in over there and I can work them into the conversation. So head on over there if you're interested in that. So now that we're on the Patreon only version of this conversation, of course, most of you probably already figured out that I will be talking about the Daniel Elder episode where the Daniel Elder essay that he wrote in response to basically his cancellation by the choral world. Um, I am not a big fan of the concept of canceling. I think people who listen to this show and listen to the rhetoric that I use, and of course, rhetoric meaning just the formal study of how to have a conversation, how to be convincing in a conversation. I just never feel like that's the right answer. I think that had the choral profession responded differently all the way back in May, when the drama around Mr. Elder and his Facebook post originally happened, might have come to a more positive conclusion. That being said, we are where we are, and he wrote this essay, posting it and kind of signing it as an open letter to the choral world, if you will, that was called "Equity Silences the Muse." And I'm just going to kind of go through it and give you some of my thoughts about this, and just as a way, possibly as a different way for many of us to think about this than you might have been exposed to before. So he starts by saying music absorbs politics at its own peril. And of course, that highlights right away a pretty sizable philosophical divide in the choral world. Dr. Ferdinand and I actually recently touched on it, which is how much of our job as choral directors is and should be political, meaning that we are using our time in front of singers as a way to present a particular worldview in rehearsal. What is the correct way to look at a political situation? Of course, political situation, as I define it, is the kind of the original definition of politics, which is something that advocates a policy, right? So if it's political, then it advocates a policy. And I kind of fall down on the side of I think less politics in the choral classroom would be better. And so I'm sympathetic a little bit right away with Daniel's point here, is that we absorb politics at our own peril, I think is a decent statement. I don't think he's saying that you should never, but we should be careful with how we approach a political commentary or a political topic in our rehearsal. We should be as the leader of the rehearsal, we should be very open to the idea that there might be kids or might be adults in our choir that see it differently than we do. And so when we present it, we might present it more as a facilitator of a conversation rather than a here is what's correct. Okay. Now, whether or not Daniel meant all that, I don't know, but that's my take on that. So then he goes on to say that a case in point is currently dominating classical music discourse is a shift towards the concept of equity of representation. Also in the episode with Dr. Ferdinand, you heard us discuss that, and he agreed with me, which was that does dominate our online conversations, in particular as a choral profession. The ideas of equity and social justice and that type of thing are dominating the conversation. That's true. Whether by composers being programmed, artistic directors being hired, or ensemble members being auditioned, we are talking a lot about this topic, meaning like how are we doing that in the most equitable way? All right. In this essay, and then he goes on to say that in this essay, I will focus exclusively on the first topic dealing with composers. In the predating concept to equity, which was equality, the music world invited diversity through the extension of equal opportunity to all. And again, like I said in the intro, I'm going to be charitable here. I agree with him here as well. The music world, I do believe, I've said this on a previous episode, we do better than most, I think, in the music world, meaning we've been open to this conversation for a while, which kudos for us. It doesn't mean that it's solved. It just means that in the music world, we've been interested in diversity for quite a while. And I think that's great. And so that's, it's not factually incorrect there, what he says. Perhaps one of the most, he goes on, perhaps one of the most notable developments of this age was the blind audition process on performance auditions. So the short version of that is he's pointing out that we went to blind auditions years ago as kind of the industry standard, specifically for the purpose of ensuring that there wasn't racial bias happening in the audition process. Well, years go by, and it hasn't really turned out that that was a solution. Okay, which that's a tough issue. That's a tough issue. So we're making the race not part of the audition, and it's still not leading to the outcomes that people predicted 25 years ago when we started talking about this when I was, in high school. I remember when blind auditions were pointed out as if they were like the super woke thing to do, and it didn't really lead to the kind of equality that we dreamed that it would. Well, now why is that? I think ultimately we've got to dig into the early years of education and how it is that we're. You can check back to an episode I did with Maria Ellis where we talked about the inequities in how young kids are taught music depending on where they grow up. And then if they're not being taught the same musical skills and rudiments that from a young age, if they grow up in an inner city versus if they're in the suburbs, and then they get to the audition process for a professional level group, we're still going to see disparities there because the kids at the younger ages aren't being educated in the same way. That's the issue. I mean, that's what we should be addressing. So back to the essay. Addressing the common arguments to follow: unequal resources of applicants. Universities carefully tended to their affirmative action programs in hopes of making musical training financially accessible to as many possible to create equal opportunity. In this paradigm, any person, regardless of gender, race, or worthy to strive for success on their own efforts, and success could be indiscriminately obtained on basis of merit. In this age, the muse was free to inspire anyone at any time. Okay. So this is where he goes wrong. So again, you look back for the first couple paragraphs. I'm not going to post any links to this. You can go find it if you want to read this as I'm talking you through it. I think he starts out the essay with some things that are probably true, factually true anyway. Where he goes wrong is that thinking that during that time when we had kind of turned the corner from what I would agree was an even more racist past in the 50s, 60s, 70s, probably, and even into the 80s, where it would have been quite common probably for a person because of their skin color to simply not be allowed to participate. 40s, 30s, right? We worked through that, and we got to a place where the colorblind audition process came into being. This is, of course, just one of many examples that he throws in there. Okay, so we made progress, right? But that doesn't mean that we had fixed something. And this kind of goes back to the education thing that I was saying before. So yes, we became colorblind in the audition process, but since the students that were in the generation that was currently auditioning for things, whether it be music programs, professional gigs, whatever it was, they're still being educated 15 years prior to that on an unequal playing field. And as we all know, kids, there is still a disparity between white kids, black kids, Hispanic kids, and really any of the racial minority groups in what types of educational experiences they're getting. And so when he says in the essay, in this age, the muse was free to inspire anyone at any time. No, they weren't. No, the muse wasn't free to inspire anyone at any time because certain kids were given the education, the musical frame of reference in their minds through good quality education in their younger years to have the musical aptitude when they get older in order to do it, right? So he's right that progress was made. He's wrong in saying that that was the golden age. Like that was the golden age back in the 90s and early 2000s when we didn't care about diversity and equity and inclusion. That's yikes, man. Okay. I told you I was going to try to be charitable, so I'm going to stick with it. Okay. So then he goes on. Like myself, countless young school kids of the 90s who fell in love with R. Kelly's I Believe I Can Fly, it just gets bizarre, benefited from my powerful message of empowerment and opportunity. Oh, from powerful messages, sorry, of empowerment and opportunity. R. Kelly's music, in other words, was empowering. And then he goes on to say, yes, I know R. Kelly was a total perv, but that doesn't change the fact that the music was good. That's not really worth talking about. The ensuing shift towards equity goes hand in hand with the emergence of identity politics as a prominent driver in recent years. As a catalyst, a silently destructive newcomer emerged in social consciousness, the victim. Talk of hierarchies of privilege and disadvantage became more frequent, somehow simultaneous to the rise in popularity of critical theory teachings in liberal arts colleges. As a result, graduates began entering the professional sphere groomed to see the world through a segregated lens of power distribution. The new concept of equity began to supplant that of equality, and music discussions began fixating on representation. So in this paragraph, this kind of falls again in the category for me of there is some truth in that, but he doesn't understand what it means. And to be honest, most people don't. So many of you, just I'll set the scene with this, will be a little bit more complicated. Um, Probably many of you have heard in the news that recently Donald Trump has started attempting to ban what they're calling on in his camp the critical race theory trainings, like equity trainings. The problem with that is that those trainings aren't critical race theory, so it's confusing people. They're based in some ideas that scholars in the critical race theory fields came up with, but they're not the same. So it's like one way I could think of it is that if I wrote a Sunday school curriculum based on scripture, but my purpose for it was to make it usable in the real modern world, and then you called it Christianity, or you called it, hey, this is just scripture. And I said, no, it's not scripture. It's based on scripture, but it's not scripture. That's kind of that's the analogy that comes to my mind with this, is that there are some in these equity trainings, some critical race theory underpinnings, but it's just not. Critical race theory is based in legal theory. It's analyzing disparities of legal treatment of different minority groups by race. Super important field to study. We shouldn't be banning critical race theory. So saying that is just kind of a misunderstanding of what that actually is. Now, the truth in there is that we have shifted towards equity conversations, meaning we've shifted towards the identity of the person being the primary driver of the conversation about what's a fair outcome and what's not a fair outcome. Now, I am sympathetic to the idea that we should be trying to balance those things, meaning we should be trying to strike a balance between whether or not we can analyze by minority group status, by ethnic group status, or gender status, whatever it is, the identity of a person, and the aggregates of the averages of all those people. We can look at the statistics about that, and we can say that, okay, in our profession or in this field of human activity, whatever it is, there's a disparity of who's getting access to this, and we should care about that. But at the same time, we should also care about, as I said in the episode with Dr. Ferdinand, we should care about quarter notes. We should also care about the musical aptitude and the quality of the music making and the skill of the singer, the player, whatever. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. And so I think what he is saying in this essay, he's sniffing around a tree of something that makes sense here. He just isn't fully explaining it the way I would prefer that it get explained. I actually recently did a Twitter feed or a Twitter thread on the topic of, and I will put this link in because it got some pretty good attention. It got turned into a thread roll thing where I tried to explain some examples of this concept of critical theory, since Trump has made it a boogeyman, which means that the people who don't know what it is now hate it. If they're on the right, of course, they hate it now because they've been told to hate it because Trump hates it or whatever. And then the problem is then on the left side of things, people have now responded to defend it without not knowing really what it is. So I prefer, as always, to come up with non-pejorative ways of explaining terms. Okay, so that's what this Twitter thread is about. And this does relate to the Daniel Elder essay. So I'm just going to kind of be you could think of it as my rebuttal to Daniel Elder talking about why it's bad that we have shifted and to include this equity part of our conversation. Balance, yes, we should be striving for balance. Okay, so here it is. This is an unfortunate state of affairs that the social justice activism and or the worldview that stems from various critical studies has been turned into a pejorative. Critical theory is now a bad word. And this is unfortunate because it is an important descriptor as it is distinct from traditional theory. So just so in case you're not familiar with the history of these theoretical approaches in academics, there was a 1937 essay by Max Horkheimer, was the inventor, by the way, of the term critical theory. And he wrote an essay that was called Traditional and Critical Theory, in which he describes a social theory oriented towards critiquing and changing society as a whole as critical theory. So if it's a critical theory, its goal is to critique and then prescribe a change to some system. Okay. In contrast to traditional theory, which is oriented only to explain how the system works and or how to build the system, right? It's a really helpful framework to think about. One way of studying something would be to talk about the problems with the thing. Another way of studying that thing would be to just talk about how that thing works, the mechanics of it. So in Horkheimer's idea, this was critical theory versus traditional theory. Okay, so critical theory has now become a boogeyman attacked by Daniel Elder in this episode and by Donald Trump and whatever. And I'm not suggesting Daniel Elder is a Trump supporter. I'm not really interested in the politics of it. I'm interested in the ideas. So frequently words are invented as neutral, but then get loaded with negative connotations by being co-opted in ideological spats and used as pejoratives, thus perverting our ability to be able to use the words constructively. We must resist this. Personally, I believe we need to not eradicate critical theories, but rather to seek a balance between them in our own thinking as well as in education. I think that there are some good faith arguments out there on what that balance currently tilts towards. Now, I do agree that we are tilting now towards critical theories in music and in many other areas of things, and I do see that as a problem. But the answer to me is to not. It doesn't mean we get rid of the critical aspects. We just try to balance them. So to illustrate this, I will invent a field of study so as to not poke any existing bears. And I'm going to call it home construction theory. So home construction is currently a vocational skill. And so by Horkheimer's definition that I talked about before, this would be a traditional theory. The goal of traditional home construction theory would be methods of understanding how to efficiently, safely, and consistently build homes that will protect inhabitants from the weather, last more than 100 years, and be comfortable to their inhabitants, etc. To master that study would be a lifetime of work. To become a master home builder would be a specialty that you would have to really focus as a human with limited time on the planet and limited resources. You wanted to really be good at building homes, you would have to master traditional home construction theory. But as you're doing that, adjacent could spring up this new thing called critical home construction theory. And the goal would be to look back at the process of the field and analyze some big data aggregates that point to the problems in the field. And this could be really valuable. It could point out disparities in access to the homes that are being built, hiring practices of the builders. Maybe they're hiring from nepotism, their own community, they're only hiring white people, whatever it is. They could be pointing out environmental harms that those that were focused on, the people building the homes might have found a favorite wood that they like, right? And then they've oversourced that wood. And unbeknownst to them, they're causing an environmental problem that they just didn't pay attention to because they're so focused on building good homes. So when balanced in the proper way, having two different groups of people that have studied home building from a different angle, that could be a net benefit to society by having both of those groups going on. And Of course, we don't want either of those groups trying to become the only group, or else then we have other problems. We'd run into issues if the critical home construction theory activists sought to be the only player in the game. If the balance tilted critically, if the balance so if the balance tilted towards critical home construction theory, that could be a big problem. uh, but if the balance tilted the other way, we would also have no canary in the coal mine to warn us of the problems that the industry was creating. So think of it this way. Well, we need both, right? We need both. Without the traditional construction pedagogy, this is where we now use the analogy in our education minds. Without traditional construction pedagogy, the next generation would be building crappy houses. They'd be building houses that don't work. And then everyone suffers. Right? Without critical construction pedagogy, though, the next generation would not be analyzing how home building was creating these negative externalities, these problems that they didn't notice. So, this is where I get into the nuance of all of this, where Daniel Elder seems to be presenting like what I'll call an anti-woke perspective on his, I guess, his woe is me story of how he got canceled. And what he could have been doing was trying to educate himself on some of these ideas before he put them out there. But that's neither here nor there. Because what some anti-woke types do rightly point out is that there are some very loud voices on social media that seem to want the critical lens to be the only lens. And that is true, and that's a problem. I've addressed that on the show many times, and I will continue to, because it is an issue. But the correct response is not to try to break the lens. We don't try to say no equity training, no talking about equity or diversity. We're not going to talk about this at all. Everybody's the same, and we've already achieved equality. Let's just forget about it. That's not the right approach. But then on the other side, what the woke rightly point out is that the steady march forward that human progress represents and the standard of living that has constantly increased since the beginning of time, really since the Industrial Revolution, we are making tons of progress. But what the woke crowd, or the diversity equity crowd that Daniel Elder is kind of arguing against here, what they get right is that some people are being left behind in that progress. We are not equally marching forward. And the why that's happening and why we're not all equally marching forward, we could have all kinds of disagreements on that. And that's okay, as long as we don't bury our head in the sand to whether or not it's happening. So instead of trying to pick a side of, am I on the diversity side, or am I on the humans are already equal, just shut up and stop talking about it, move on side, I would suggest that both sides embrace both lenses. Think about what traditional theory in Horkheimer's mind is versus what critical theories are, and use both. Because we need to. In the music classroom, this will be kind of the way I tie this together. In the music classroom, think about how our choirs would sound if all we talked about were the disparities in music in class and then occasionally sang. We just wouldn't be very good choirs. Kids would quit choir. It wouldn't be very fun, and they wouldn't ever learn to sound good. So which part of what we're doing in a choir classroom when we're teaching the rudiments, as Dr. Ferdinand and I talked about, how to sing well, how to blend well, how to create resonance, how to sing in tune, that's traditional choral theory. Talking about social justice in a choral rehearsal is critical choral theory. Okay, we need to do both, but we need to balance them. We can't favor one over the other, or else we will have issues that creep up that we're not aware of, because everything in life is about balance. This was, of course, a deep dive for this Patreon episode. I realize that this is not the kind of thing I normally do in the Patreon-only episodes, but this has been on my chest, sitting heavy since the whole incident, and I just needed to vent. So thanks for listening. If I went in too nerdy of a direction, then I apologize. I probably won't do many episodes like this on Patreon, but I think it's important. And if you learned something from this little discussion, great. And if not, of course, you can always shoot back. As you know, I am happy to have you disagree with me or point out any flaws in my reasoning. But again, I think that we are better off as a field if we learn to balance the ideas that are being discussed in these types of online situations where the canceling of Daniel Elder on Facebook and the responses, the angry responses that he got back were not super great either, you guys, honestly. Because they also lacked the nuance of recognizing that there needs to be a balance. We need to build that into our public conversation, in my opinion. All right, see you guys later. I'll see you on the private feed again in November, maybe around turkey time. Thanks a lot, guys.